Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever any of you guys are watching this, including you, Mrs. Jones. This is going to be my first SCC project that I decided to go for. It is the 3 practice speeches. Um, Hopefully, I get this down, and by the end of this, I have a good, concise speech that I can bring to class. Let's see. May 12th, 2002. I was born 10:47 in the morning, hot fresh out of the womb, upset, loud, vibrant, full of life. Probably one of the most important days of my mother's life. In fact, it's probably the most seminal moment in my mother's life. But there were a lot of other things that important happened on that day in history. 1820. So I have the same birthday with Florence Nightingale. She is considered to be one of the most important women in history to begin with. She had a lot to do with the implementation of modern nursing practices. I mean, she is the mother or the founder of modern nursing. One of the big things that happened whenever she was in the hospitals when she first started taking care of people was that she was beginning to notice that a lot of the soldiers were coming in disease-riddled, and even though they had plenty of wounds and a lot of complications from the war, most of the deaths were coming from the lack of sanitation and the spread of disease. Obviously, that was one of the big things that she had noticed, and so she began to implement a lot of safety procedures in terms of sanitation, cleaning up bedpans, washing linens, making sure the soldiers had fresh clothes, hydration, good ventilation in the hospitals. It was all very important in keeping a lot of these people alive and able to recover from their illnesses, or not, well, maybe not their illnesses, but recovering from their wounds before succumbing to death by disease. It was a really common thing, and wonderfully she put a stop to that. Or maybe not a stop, but pause, a little bit of a lower. 1949, Soviet Russia lifted its blockade on West Berlin. Many of you know that in World War II, Soviet Russia implemented the wall that was there in Berlin that separated East and West. Um, Whenever they had lifted it on May 12th, a lot of the people that were noticing this, especially the Western Allies, thought that it was some kind of front. And so many people kind of still were very nervous about crossing over and basically going into West Berlin, but Western Allies continued with air supplies. They were bringing candies, medical equipment, food, obviously propaganda, booklets, pamphlets, things like that. Everything was being dropped onto West Berlin. One of the big things that happened from this is it created the social divide between West and East Berlin. Many of you probably know about the difference of them. And then after that, the Berlin Wall was lifted in 1989. I think June, or no, it was November 9th, 1989. But that was what would happen. And then in 1796, the smallpox vaccine was implemented. It was developed by Dr. Edward Jenner, and this was basically an injection. It was a more mild version of smallpox, many vaccines that we have today are the exact same idea. It's a dead or a very inactive version of the disease. It's simply put into the body to allow the immune system to become aware of what this disease is, how to react, how to handle it, so that way whenever the real one hits, got a little bit of a chance to go on there. It was actually incredibly successful. Almost 70% of deaths were reduced from this vaccine within the span of 18 months, which is pretty fast. May 12th, 2002. I, Andres Ramirez, or many of you may know me by Julius, popped out of the womb. This, of course, was an incredibly important day in my mother's life, probably the most seminal moment in my mother's life. There were a lot of other important things that happened on that day in different years. Let's dive in. 1820, probably one of the most famous women in history, Florence Nightingale, was born. The big thing with her was that she was incredibly important in the implementation of sanitary practices in hospitals. One of the big things that had happened was when she had been introduced into the war effort in the Crimean War, a lot of soldiers that were coming in died. And obviously, yeah, they died from battle wounds and gunshot wounds, things like that. But most of them had actually died from disease. Most of these soldiers that had died from disease could have very much overcome their ailments. And one of the big things was that she implemented cleaning the bedpans, washing linens, making sure that everybody had clean clothes, and ventilation and hydration. Those are two very big things that were not readily available in hospitals: good water and good air. Obviously, if you've got a very poorly ventilated area, disease just festers. And so that was one of the more important things that she had actually brought how do we say, like a solution. She introduced good ventilation in these tents, which further brought itself into hospitals, which we have today. It's very, very advanced HVAC systems. And she was probably, wow, I said that twice. And then in 1949, Soviet Russia had actually lifted its wall in Berlin. Now, this is not to be confused with the lift of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Those are totally two different separate events. The one in 1949 was simply due to the fact that Soviet Russia was losing a lot of money. They had a massive economic impact from the war. They needed to open up that area so that way they could implement trade, and that's about it, really, trade. Western allies took advantage of this, and they decided to go ahead and start flying their planes over. They decided to fly their planes over, dropping off candies, food, medical equipment, and one of the big ones that we probably don't think about, they dropped a lot of propaganda. This had actually created a huge cultural divide, and many of us are aware of it. Western Berlin and Eastern Berlin. This is kind of where it started from, because Western Berlin was getting all of this help from our Western allies, whereas Eastern Berlin was still in the slums. It was a very difficult time. And then in 1796, on May 12th, Dr. Edward Jenner, or however you pronounce it, Jenner, I'm not really sure. He introduced the smallpox vaccine on that day. What it was a very simple vaccine. It was what we are aware of as vaccines today. It was a little shot that you would put in that had a dead or nullified, or not nullified, but nulled out version of smallpox that would allow your immune system to become aware of what it was and implement good techniques to fight it. Obviously, I'm not an immune system. I don't know disease fighting techniques. This was incredibly important and very, very successful. Within 18 months of it being dispersed publicly, it actually brought nearly 70% of the smallpox deaths down. So let's just say 100 people were dying in 2020, and then in 2022, only 30 people died. Not sound like a lot, but in terms of large population, it's a big deal. May 12th, 2002. I was born. My name is Andres Ramirez, or as many of you may know me by as Julius. I popped out of my mother's womb. Very red, bloody, angry, fighting the world, upset that I was displaced out of the most comfortable place in my home, or in the world. A lot of important things that happened that day, including to my mother, probably one of the most important moments of our life. But there were plenty of other very important things that happened on that day, including in 1820, Florence Nightingale, probably one of the most important women in history. She was the modern mother of nursing. She really helped implement a lot of sanitary practices in hospitals. One of the big things that happened was that she was used for the war effort in Crimea. The war went on a lot longer than it needed to, or a lot longer than it had been expected to. And a lot of these hospitals with wounded soldiers were experiencing massive death tolls from soldiers that really didn't need to die. A lot of them were succumbing to disease. That was the big thing. And so what she really helped do was, again, sanitation, cleaning the beds, making sure that bed sheets were taken care of, making sure the patients had new clothes. And the big two, ventilation and hydration. A lot of these soldiers were super dehydrated and didn't have enough in their systems to keep themselves alive. And poor ventilation. I mean, if you're in an area with a lot of diseased patients and a lot of stagnant air, it's gonna float around, and a lot of more people are gonna get sick that don't need to be sick. Another thing that had happened on that day, 1949, the Berlin Wall had been brought up. Now, this is not to be confused with the Berlin Wall coming up in 1989. It was a totally different event, and this had a lot more to do with directly after the war, Soviet Russia had brought up the wall because of major economic failures. Of course, Western allies took advantage of this, and a lot of them had flown their planes over Western Berlin to drop off supplies. Things like candy, food, water, medical equipment, and one of the big ones that a lot of people don't particularly talk about is propaganda. Lots and lots and lots of propaganda was dropped from these planes onto Western Berlin. Because of this, it created probably one of the most notable differences in the socioeconomic impact in that area. I mean, we all know West Berlin versus East Berlin. It was a huge difference, and that was really a lot where it had started. And then, on that same day, in 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner had basically introduced the smallpox vaccine, probably one of the most important vaccines out there, including like the polio vaccine. Well, actually, this is about smallpox. What really happened was it was basically an injection that they would give to the patient. All it was a dormant or kind of nulled out version of smallpox, and what it did was it allowed the body's immune system to become recognized and aware of what that disease was, how to fight it, things like that. The vaccine was actually proven to be incredibly successful. Within the span of 18 months, it had actually brought the death toll down by nearly 70%. That's huge. Just for small layman's terms, I mean, 100 people within 18 months, 100 of them were expected to die, but only 30 did because of this vaccine. Obviously, it went down further and further as time progressed.